Hello and welcome to this video on if the arachnids from Starship Troopers make sense from a biology perspective. To be clear in this, we are talking about the body functions and performance, and not the species as a whole. We've addressed the question of the arachnid species separately. Spoiler, but it is a matter of simple numbers and they have more. No wait, that's a separate issue again. In this case, we are going to talk about the anatomy and physiology of the arachnid. For that reason, we'll focus on the warrior bug. But most, if not all, of the information should apply to the variant of the arachnid, just to differing scales. Of course, our model and explanations may need slight changes or tweaks, but an overarching theme and process, along with explanation, should still be possible and applicable.
Every day, federal scientists are looking for new ways to kill bugs.
Your basic arachnid warrior isn't too smart, but you can blow off a limb, and it's still 86% combat effective. Here's a tip. Aim for the nerve stem and put it down for good.
Would you like to know more?
As Starship Troopers has shown, the basic gross anatomy is fairly straightforward. Just remember to aim for the nerve stem and you will survive. Each time you hit that nerve stem, a warrior will go down. Repeat until all hostiles in sight are eliminated, and then put a few more rounds in the nerve stem to make sure. You don't want any accidents. It is the rest of the arachnid warrior that gets difficult. The warrior is a six-legged, carapaced creature. It is fast and deadly. The warrior has huge mandibles on a relatively small body and head, ignoring the mandibles. It is about 5 meters long and 3 meters tall. However, this is an overall measurement, not a measure of the thorax, head and abdomen. Consider the differences in your size if we were to measure from your pelvis to your head. Ignoring your legs, there is a huge difference, and there's a reason why we don't do it that way for humans. However, for insects, it's a different matter. Consider that the body itself is not much taller, that is, the back of the actual abdomen and thorax, than the mandible itself is. Wider, certainly, but not necessarily taller. This does make life easier for us in this video, as we can focus on a very small area of the arachnid for most basic life functions. The hard part is the same as modern technology. How do you fit so much equipment, parts or features into a tiny package? Or in our case, how do you fit organs and essential life functions in a very small head, thorax and abdomen? Let's work from the most essential functions to the functions that are there but we kinda need to question. And first and foremost, respiration and cardiovascular systems. Put more simply, does it have a heart and can it breathe? This is actually one of the points that various creators on YouTube have taken issue with. The arachnid, given its size and relative static shell, shouldn't be able to breathe using conventional methods, like humans do for instance, using the diaphragm, movement of the skeleton and muscles. Instead, it needs to be doing something else. And this is true. The same thing with the cardiovascular system to some extent. How do you push enough nutrient, oxygen if it's using oxygen, and more around the body? Given the size and activity of the arachnid warrior, we do need to look at how it can pump the most basic of essentials around its body. That is to move blood full of nutrients and oxygen, how it gets the oxygen in the first place. Our first problem is something that has been solved in nature already, and we can look to ants and you'll see they have no lungs or way to breathe like a human. Instead, they have a comparably unique system. This is called a spiracle. Each spiracle is connected to a finer branching series of tubes called tracheae. These act in a way similar to lungs, except they're not relying on hemoglobin like the human body, or in fact most mammals do, if not all mammals and other creatures on Earth, with a more developed body. Instead, the tracheae in the case of ants, and theoretically applicable to our warrior, spread throughout the body, and each of the branches gets to a point where it ends in a wall. This creates a thin, fine end to it, and that thin, fine end acts just like the alveoli in the human lung. It allows for gas to diffuse across and into the bloodstream. In humans, this would enter into red blood cells. Obviously, not possible, given what we're about to say regarding warriors, but understand it's the same concept. Larger and more active insects do need to supplement this process though, and they do so using a passive breathing system. This is done by flexing their abdomens, and this essentially mechanically functions as a large-scale version of the diaphragm. It squishes and then opens up those tracheae, forcing air in and out. Theoretically, the physical actions of the arachnid warrior, as they're moving, could be doing exactly this. In fact, if we have the tracheae and we have the spiracle, we may be able to explain why it is that arachnids can exist in a vacuum. That is because universities have found that many insects at a small size, and again theoretically we can scale this up, are able to close their spiracles. They don't do this to try and solve the issue of not getting enough oxygen. Rather, due to their size, they need to close it to prevent over-oxygen saturation. While in an ant, it would stop excess oxygen entering into it. Importantly, for our warrior, it would be able to stop the loss of oxygen in the void of space. And this is one of the key things here. A lot of the criticism of the arachnids and their ability to be oxygen-based is premised on the assumption that they would need to breathe somehow. But this is like a super complicated version of holding your breath. The cardiovascular systems are a bit different, and warriors and arachnids may have an open circulatory system. This would explain a lot of what we see. However, it does present some other issues that it could theoretically support the nature of the warriors as we see them. This is a system where body fluid is pumped directly into the body, and it circulates more or less of its own accord. It finds its way to various organs and internal cavities. Strictly speaking, what's being pumped around is not blood, but a fluid called hemolymph. While hemolymph is not blood like a human would have, it is effectively the same thing. It has all of the same functions, just in a slightly different format. What is special about closed systems is that they tend to contribute to various functions that are important, and we'll get to a lot of these shortly, but one of the big ones is going to be the dorsal vessel. The dorsal vessel is an anti-equivalent to a heart. Because of what it is, and it is structurally very distinct and different, it does have a common function, and that is to pump blood into an aorta-like structure, and this then allows blood to flow one way out of the heart. It will enter and it will leave, but always in one direction. Even though it's pumping hemolymph and not blood, it's the same process and the same needs. It will pass from the body, or the abdomen, into the thorax, and then get to the head. Within this structure, and in fact within the various other vessel structures along the dorsal element of the arachnid warrior, we have ostia. Ostia are small valves. These valves are important as they are what ensure the hemolymph or blood only flows away from the heart. This prevents backflow. Ensuring directionality to blood flow will become very important in a short time, but we'll get to that eventually. Just understand, this is an important feature for something else later on. The next major anatomical feature we wanted to discuss is just that though. It's heat. More accurately, dissipation of heat. This is both a major feature of the warrior and essential for life. There is a large rear-facing part of the warrior in its abdomen. This is both a way to dissipate heat and hold the quasi-heart of the arachnid that we've just mentioned. The duality of this is actually a boon out of combat. In combat, it is a massive liability. Assuming an otherwise normal situation, the large rearward part of the abdomen will collect all the blood flowing away from the heart. That is effectively the hemolymph. This fluid returns from the body. Because it is returning from the rest of the arachnid's body, it will be hot. it will have been heated by the various metabolic processes going on around the arachnid warrior. By having what acts as a massive, huge radiator that the hot blood enters first, it allows for the blood heat to be radiated away. Removing the heat from the hemolymph is important because it does this before it re-enters the circulatory system. Before it goes back into the quasi-heart, the hemolymph is cooled down and then pumped back around to the body again. This is somewhat similar to how our human body uses the gradient of CO2 to both facilitate oxygen exchange, but also to tell our body when to breathe or increase respiration rates. By increasing the heat of the arachnid warrior, such as when in combat, it can increase the heart-like structure's heart rate and therefore push more of the hemolymph around the warrior's body. This will not only ensure that the body cools down, similar to the way a human would sweat, but it also delivers nutrition to those areas that are seeing the most activity. It also draws away the heat. This therefore means that those large radiator-like parts of the abdomen are really important. This function is by no means a unique phenomena. For instance, we can say with confidence that dinosaurs and modern cold-blooded organisms, and even some birds, use a similar feature to control body temperature. It would stand to reason that the arachnid, given what it is and its somewhat limited functionality due to its nature, would develop particular means to deal with temperature, and more so given it has a limited set of tools available. This would also be why the arachnid warrior has an extremely high amount of vascular tissue here. That vascular tissue is needed to allow for the hemolymph to dump the heat from within the body of the arachnid warrior into the outside world. At the same time, that vascular tissue is a massive vulnerability, somewhat similar to our own jugular, femoral vein, and so on. Once it's penetrated, the arachnid warrior will start to bleed out, and bleed out very quickly. After the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and how the arachnid warrior dissipates heat, we have digestion. And that's because everything that lives eats. Everything that eats poops. Given how active the arachnids are, they are very much alive. That means they must eat, and theoretically eventually poop. How they eat and how they get nutrition is a challenge. Consider our own GI tract. It is long, convoluted, and big. It has a whole load of different enzymes, organ structures, and more, all involved in ensuring we get the most out of whatever we consume. To even get to the GI tract though of a warrior, we need to pass from the arachnid, and passing through the arachnid is hard. In fact, it's a feat much easier said than done. The oral opening, or equivalent to your mouth, is here, right between the two very large mandibles, and is a very small opening. Shreds or ribbons of human flesh can pass through, but anything more solid than chunky soup will be stopped. Further, once in the oral cavity, we pass a relatively short way into the esophagus and then the stomach. An arachnid would need a short, compact, and effective GI tract after their stomach, something effectively like a carnivorous predator than the GI tract of a human. Think how much shorter a wolf, lion, or tiger's GI tract is versus a human's. In fact, most herbivores or omnivores for that matter. The challenge is there. It has to be short because they don't really have the diversity of food that an omnivore would. The other feature that is important, and we strongly believe the warrior would need to be carnivorous. This is a big thing, and we've seen no evidence to the contrary, which is one reason to say it, but the other is, as mentioned, the fact that there's not a lot of room inside the body of the arachnid warrior. There is no practical way to get the calories and nutrition required in the volumes and then deliver those volumes to the warrior without it being meat of some description. Whether that is the other forbidden white meat, or smaller organisms, again, such as the chariot bug, isn't so important. It's the short GI tract. It would start with the stomach breaking down your meat into protein. The protein would likely then be further broken down, both mechanically and chemically, into short lengths of amino acids. Now these are likely to be polypeptides, that is, more than 2 or 3 at a time amino acids, but not short enough to be able to be absorbed into the body of the host yet. This is where the short intestinal system would be important. It would need to be able to easily absorb nutrients and water if required, and importantly, the protein. Now, the protein would need to be broken down into short single amino acids. Anything bigger than that and you have other issues. So there would need to be a somewhat complex and very effective system of releasing enzymes to break down the polypeptides that are inside the intestine. The other option that could be possible, but is less likely, is if the arachnids have a way to generate a syrup or nutrient soup. Think Nutriloaf, but in liquid form. It's a literal liquid product that removes the need for most digestion and can be readily absorbed through even the smallest and shortest of intestinal tracts. Just like milk for a baby when they feed, it's the same idea, just more complex and more complete, given it's a much bigger organism and it has requirements that a baby does not. And now we have the movement of the warrior, and this again is surprisingly easy since we have existing species on Earth that exhibit similar behavior, or at least have similar requirements. The humble ant is the perfect example of this, although the ant does have one slight hiccup. It works on an alternating tripod basis, whereas the arachnid would be working on the premise of 4 legs, so they'd only be able to use 2 at a time rather than 3 at a time. What happens with the ant is that the front and back legs of one side and the middle leg of the other side move together when it travels. If we're talking about something similar with the arachnid warrior, it would likely be closer to a horse, where depending on what's happening, it may choose to change different feet moving in different ways based on the speed of its action. But it is very likely to be relying more heavily on its back legs, which are much bigger and are therefore able to provide the necessary force to jump or throw itself forward. Importantly, for discussions of the warrior, the ant's second body segment, otherwise known as the mesosoma, but for the purposes of this video we'll just call it the abdomen, is packed with a lot of muscle. And all of this muscle is largely dedicated to moving its legs. That movement is a big thing. Because it has so much muscle power, it has a lot of strength relative to its size. Given the speed and nature of the arachnid warrior, it would be why the 2 front-facing limbs with claws are so very quick, and why it can, if need be, use its legs as weapons as well, given that they also have what are effectively massive spears. This same area would also need to power the mandibles, however, and that is one slight hiccup. The amount of strength required from these mandibles is really ridiculous. It's the same mandibles able to shear steel pipe or trusses holding outpost whiskey walls up. It's a lot of strength. Yes, it is true that it's tubular steel, and therefore hollow in the middle, but it's still strong. It's why it's used is lightweight, but ridiculously strong for its size. Or more accurately, mass. Nonetheless, they're able to shear through these or crush them. You need a lot of power for that to happen. Admittedly, ants can do something similar. They can exhibit huge amounts of strength. But nonetheless, it's one part of this that is a slight, let's say, hiccup, but it's not a major flaw, it's just something to be aware of. The other design element to the arachnid warrior that is worth comparing is that ants, in a similar manner to the arachnid warrior, have a large percentage of their mass on one side or the other of their body. In the case of ants, it's about 60% of it is in their abdomen. In the case of the arachnid warrior, a large proportion is actually in the front, effectively in its head, and that's due to those mandibles. Rather than backloading with weight like the ant, the arachnid warrior is front-loaded with weight far to the front from their mandibles, and this is entirely possible based on the idea of an ant. Less explicitly clear is, well, the issue of armour. More accurately, putting movement to a side, as we've been through that now, we need to talk about the exoskeleton that makes up that armour. It is a chitin-like, if not chitinous shell. That shell can stop large caliber bullets at 7.62mm, but not only can it stop them, but it stops them from exiting out the backside of the arachnid warrior. When the caliber bullet is spoken about in Starship Troopers, that 7.62mm bullet should be able to penetrate 50mm or about 2 inches of titanium plate. That is a lot of strength in exoskeleton that is carried around on a very nimble platform. If you compare it to something like our armoured fighting vehicles of today, although unlikely to have exactly the same armour ratios, you'll find that most of the armour plating on those vehicles is quite thin, and they either sacrifice the use of steel for something else. In the case of the APCs that you would see from the Vietnam War, sacrifice the armour value for decrease in weight by using something like aluminium. In other countries, they've gone the opposite way. Other countries have put a very heavy-duty steel plate that is incredibly thick on their vehicles. You either have that thick and heavy, which is slow, like a tank, or that thin and light, which has no armour. The Arachnid has managed to get the best of both worlds. It has achieved the perfect idea of the tank triad: speed, armour, and firepower, although it doesn't actually have a ranged weapon. What it does use is kiten, and kiten is a polymer. It's a naturally occurring polymer made up of something very much derived from glucose. The N-acetylglycosamine is able to bond together and form a long chain, in a way similar to cellulose, so think of wood. But it's also made up of crystalline parts of it that form nanofibrils or whiskers. These are closer to what you would see in your nails, or hair for that matter, are just more closely bound together. It's why your fingernails and toenails are relatively strong, somewhat by comparison to your hair. But for the purposes of the warrior's function and seemingly nigh invincible ability to act as a shield to its fellow warrior bugs, the kiten that is here must be built in such a way as to be able to at least nominally be light in the relative context of the warrior, but also very strong. Just making the Arachnid warrior kiten shell thicker would not do this, and is perhaps why the arachnids we see are not made up of massive thick shells, but seemingly thin shells of the kiten that are then covering and protecting the soft inner squishy goodness. The reason for this is very simple. It is because the thicker the kiten shell gets, the weaker it becomes. Not because the idea is bad, but because nature is a bad builder. The thicker the shell, the more defects it will have. That is inclusions, voids, and more. These will weaken the kiten shell. To do this, and the warrior must do so, it has to be able to build a bulletproof layer of the kiten shell, but it must build it layer by layer, and most likely somewhere between 5 and 10mm or 0.2 to 0.4 freedom units at a time. This would need to be built up to stop the 7.62 by 51mm round. Based on the most closely matched modern bullet of the same kind, it produces a maximum pressure force of 450 megapascals or about 60,000 psi. As each 5 to 10mm layer of kiten can withstand about 60 to 70 megapascals, the resulting shell of each arachnid warrior would need to be somewhere between 15 to 20mm or 0.6 to 0.8 freedom units. That is between 2 and 4 layers of kiten per side. Importantly, it means bullets penetrating one side of the shell would lose power, slow down, be caught by the internal viscera, and then hit the other side, with little to no remaining energy. It would explain why we don't see any exit wounds. This of course also ignores the effect that angling the shell would have on even the bullets of the Morita combat rifle. There is some scope for this figure to be more or less accurate. Depends on if the inner kiten the warrior has is wet. That is, there's a lower breaking point, and it could provide a degree of dampening to the bullet if the kiten inside the shell is wet. It's the same way a bulletproof vest catches a bullet in a woven net and does not just block the bullet like a bulletproof plate. Admittedly, the bulletproof plate does create other issues due to shock, but nonetheless. The presence of wet chitin on the inner aspect of the shell and the dry chitin on the outer aspect would explain why we see practically no overpenetrations or exit wounds on the warrior. The bullet is simply caught and stopped. This would also explain why the MI must fire a ridiculous number of bursts at each warrior to put them down. The bullets are causing some harm to the warrior, but the damage is limited until one of two things happen. Either the inner chitin is pulped and the bullets now pass through the shell unimpeded and therefore can cause regular ballistic or bullet damage, or the small amount of damage that each bullet causes despite the chitin shell builds up to a level that is lethal. There is a third possibility, but it's unrelated to the bullet itself in so many words. That is, the end result is related, but the process is slightly different. The warrior would receive too much trauma and die from blood loss or shock or similar due to the sheer pulping it has received. The final element we've been putting off until now is the neurology. The central nervous system is not located in as vulnerable a location as it is in humans. That is where we have our brains right behind our eyes and fairly front and center. The arachnid warrior has their brain considerably further back and more protected. This area is where the nerve stem is located, and this tells us the arachnid has no true brain as such. A phenomena that makes sense with such a crude, simple and low-functioning creature. Or should we just describe it as arachnid ammunition? Think of it as the difference between a lead bullet and a cruise missile. The degree of complexity is very different as they have very different roles to play. The same way you have a huge difference between, say, a regular bug and a chicken. This makes a degree of sense, or at least the phenomena does, since is a very crude and simple, low-functioning creature. And that's important. It doesn't actually have a lot of higher functionality requirements, so it doesn't really need any of this extra material. It's a waste of resources if you're just trying to think of it as, well, a simplistic creature that is existing solely to kill and destroy. Further to the brain, we do have two other parts of the biology related to the nervous system. The first is the peripheral nervous system. That is control of the extremities, mandibles, and basically everything not in the brain, as it seems unlikely that there's a spinal cord in this arachnid warrior. This is important as the arachnid warrior is said to lack pain receptors, a practical impossibility, as the arachnid would have no way to use or work with its environment without some sort of sensory feedback. We assume that when this is said, it is an oversimplification of the warrior has no ability to process the signal as pain. It can still recognize that it's missing a limb, a claw, or any other damage, enough so that it knows that there's something that it needs to attack in that direction, but it doesn't necessarily perceive it as pain. This phenomena is not impossible with conditions like anhidrosis and congenital insensitivity to pain in humans. It would need to be somewhat different again, but it would nonetheless explain some of what we see. For example, though, if there was no sense of pain and no feedback, a version of the arachnid warrior, like the plasma bug, wouldn't be able to know when it's time to fire its plasma shot. And since it can't take its shot, it has no hope in life of getting a girlfriend. What is important is that the central nerve stem sits right on top of the main juncture points for the limbs. This means that very little peripheral nerve system actually needs to be present. That's because the signals themselves need travel only a very short distance to activate the muscles that move the warrior bug. Of course, not all elements of the peripheral nervous system are so small. Things like the ventral vents and nerve stems are a very distant structure, but they are essential. These are like the ears of an arachnid warrior, providing balance and a sense of direction. And nonetheless, by acting very much like human ear canals, they provide balance and direction, but they also create another benefit. Where the ants rely on the tripod-like movement of 6 legs, 2 sets of 3, the arachnid warrior can move with 2, and part of this is down to the presence of those senses that provide balance and allow it to know whether or not the way it's moving is the direct action, what to do to compensate for it, and whether or not they're going to go forwards, which is the primary direction an arachnid will travel. The other element that is somewhat important to the arachnid warrior are its eyes. The arachnid warrior wanders around happily in dark caverns when not in combat. It also charges across bright open plains to its death, generally in the thousands. Therefore, the warrior must have both very low light and daylight vision capacity. It might even be accurate to say that it needs to have at least some form of night vision, which is a little bit beyond what we're expecting, but nonetheless, there is a case that can be made for night vision. Interestingly enough, most arthropods have at least one of 2 types of eye, and these 2 types of eye cover everything that we've spoken about, these being your lateral compound eyes and your smaller median ocelli. The lateral compound eyes tend to be used in daylight conditions, think your normal vision and sight, whereas the ocelli act in low light conditions. The ocelli also have another benefit. They have a fast response time. Ocelli can detect low light and work with it and respond quickly. Compound eyes can find edges and details, and by having both of these working together, the arachnid warrior could be very efficient as a killing machine. Well, it actually is very efficient as a killing machine, but this explains some of its functionality. The presence of both would explain everything, but it's likely that there would only be a small and possibly primitive version of the fast-moving and detecting eyes, these being the compound eyes. That's because they would largely only be used in combat, versus what would be the larger or more developed low-light eyes, the ocelli, and these would be used when travelling and for non-combat activity. As odd as it may seem, the arachnid could very well be real, survive, and be based or at least evolve along the same lines as examples from our own planet, of the features that we've described. This should put to rest arguments from some creators that the arachnids simply cannot exist. We've already explained the variety and what may have driven the arachnids as a species to exist. Now, the basic warrior's anatomy and physiology that allows them to live on a day-to-day basis, as an individual subvariant. The only thing left is to enlist for your term of service, a decision that may be as long as the Federation deems necessary. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.